So this is the first investigation that's ever happened in the building that I know of since it was built in 1855. And I think it's important to find out if there's anyone in the building, if there's anything going on, just so we know to treat it with a little bit of respect towards these spirits that might be here. The research that Christian was doing into the executions is actually really interesting to me. That I didn't know that the public hangings were, that one of them happened so close here. It's literally, you look out the back door and you could have seen where it was going on. So I think that's a possibility that it could be someone held in that jail. Also, this building was where they tried everyone in the city. So there's a lot of people coming in and out, being charged with things they may or may not have been guilty of. So I think it's important to treat the past visitors who have come through here, or the past residents who might still be here, with a little bit of respect, and just kind of learn more about them.
My name is Christian Crouch. I am the assistant curator here at the Lynchburg Museum System, and I've been recently doing some research that actually came about as a part of a very small snippet of a book. The title of the book is Lynchburg and Its People. It's by William Asbury Christian, and he wrote a very small passage about an execution that happened in Lynchburg, and this was around 1829-ish. And so when I was reading that, he mentioned that there were a couple of executions, because he wrote this much later in life, and he mentioned that there were a few executions, and so I was like, oh man, I wonder what these executions were. So I delved into it a little bit, found a ton of newspapers about the different facets of these things. William Hendricks, he was actually the second execution, and he was executed for murder. The first execution was John Jones. He was in 1829, and he was executed also for murder. And then we have John Hancock, who was the last execution. He was the most modern execution in 1898, and he was actually executed for, it's not quite clear. It's sort of this weird interim between rape and attempted rape. It doesn't actually clarify that, but it does say, it's something similar to that. So we'll start with John Hancock and actually go backwards. So John Hancock was actually an African-American man, and he was employed under a man. His first initial was A and Messenger. I don't know what his first name was, but he was employed under an A Messenger. And A Messenger had a niece whose name was Bertie Messenger, and I think another niece named Rosa Cone. And they were both living at his house where John Hancock was working. And John Hancock apparently went into their room, allegedly went into their room, threatened both of the girls at knife point, and committed the deed of he was accused of. It's a very interesting fact of this whole thing that African American people generally in this time period were the only ones that were actually executed for rape and attempted rape. There's not a single, well, very few white peoples that were actually executed for this type of crime. It is almost invariably African American people, and so this already presents a very interesting case. And then beyond that, the actual trial itself had a couple of weird quirks in it, where afterwards they submitted these appeal requests where they said, there's new evidence that has popped up that actually warrants a retrial. Something happened in the case that warrants a retrial. So there were a few of these that popped up that are most likely standard, but could have been anything. We don't exactly know what these things would have been. And so his whole case was very, very interesting. He was actually the only one of the three that were executed nearby this building. The Lynchburg Museum actually sits basically in front of where the city jail used to be. If you go to the museum, go behind the building, and then go across the street, there's a large wall that actually encloses where the jail yard was. That jail yard is where he was executed. He was actually executed in that jail yard. The other two were actually over at Old City Cemetery. So it's a little bit different of a thing. So William Hendricks was the second man who was actually executed in Lynchburg, publicly executed in Lynchburg. And he was a guest or a resident of a place called the Cabell House, which was on the corner of 11th and Main Street, actually downtown. That house was known as a house of disreputable character, which we all know what that means. And he apparently got into a fight with a man named Thomas Johnson. he alleges that up to his execution that it was in self-defense, that he fought back. It wasn't him that instigated it. He had no premeditated condition whatsoever, that he wasn't necessarily in the wrong for this one. And so we don't know very much information. This is actually the least informed one that we have. It happened in 1860. So that was the beginning of the Civil War. There was a lot of stuff happening right then, and so there's not a lot of info about that whole execution. But what we do know is that he was brought to Old City Cemetery. He had a reverend of his choice talk at length about the sins of body houses and keeping bad company, among a few other things. He publicly mentioned that to everybody, to the 8,000 people that were watching that execution. And so he was summarily hung on the gallows, and that was sort of that. The earliest man was actually John M. Jones. This is a pretty famous one around Lynchburg. Old City Cemetery actually has a pretty good amount of information on him as well. They actually have a plaque on a little stone out there to him out there. But I did a little bit more research on it and tried to dig up a little bit more information. And there is an overwhelming amount of information about this guy, so I will not take up everybody's time by saying everything. So John M. Jones got into a fight with another man over down by the riverfront. It's not exactly clear on where that was on the riverfront. He was most likely in a tavern or some kind of a brothel or something like that, because he was drinking a ton of gin with another dude. And so he witnessed this body lady, let's call her, witnessed this body lady get struck by the eventual man that he murdered. His name was George Hamilton. He struck the body lady, and John Jones stood up and was like, hey, don't do that, I don't like that. It's not super clear on whether or not he was involved with this woman or a customer of this woman or something else. His uncle actually owned another brothel in town, so there is a chance that this could have been a body lady that worked for his uncle that he was maybe protecting in some way. It's not clear, we're not sure, but he was involved with her in some extent. And so they got into a fight. They got some fisticuffs. They got broken up, and John Jones was angry and stewing. So he went to his uncle's house, and George Hamilton went down to his boat that was actually moored on the river. John Jones, stewed around and was stomping around his uncle's place, got a weapon. He actually got a dirk, which is like a small pointed dagger. It's mainly like a stabbing weapon. And he proclaimed, and I want to make sure I get the exact quote here because it is pretty, it's pretty funny actually on what they said he said. Let's see. Yep. So John Jones, he actually pulled out a dirk, which is like a pointed little stabbing dagger type of deal, and he exclaimed, God damn him, I will see his heart's blood before night. In the trial, they made it abundantly clear he could have been talking about anybody. However, it's more than likely he was talking about George Hamilton. They had recently gotten into a fight. That's probably the person he was angry about, who knows. So he exclaimed that, and he was actually going to go outside and go meet up with George Hamilton and more than likely just stab him. George Hamilton was actually on his way to the uncle's house, and somebody, a mutual friend between the two, stopped Hamilton outside and said, well, man, he's armed in there. You don't want to go in there. He's angry. Don't go on in there. And so Hamilton was like, well, okay, if he's armed, then I'm going to do something about that. So he went back down to his boat and got a large stick, which could have been really anything. Could have been an actual stick, could have been an oar, could have been a pole, whatever. He got some kind of a stick. And went back up to Jones's uncle's house. They met in the proverbial parking lot, and Hamilton actually took the stick and just hit him over the side of the head across another guy. It actually is quoted as saying that Hamilton struck Jones over the shoulder of another man. And so Jones fared really pretty well, honestly, for being hit in the face with a stick. He just got a small little gash in his head and bandaged it up. Hamilton proceeded to be sort of a college boy about it and started taking rocks and throwing them at the windows to provoke him in some way to actually get him to come back out again. So Hamilton left, went back down to his boat, and was, posturing to all of his friends. Jones left the house and then went up on Main Street to a gunsmith. Keep in mind, he was probably really drunk on gin, and so how this gunsmith didn't really care about this, you could really pull anything out of that. But he went to the gunsmith and apparently mumbled under his breath that he was going to kill somebody, and the gunsmith didn't hear it, and so that was its own thing. He was offered 3 guns. He tried 2, didn't like them, took the 3rd gun, walked all the way back down to Hamilton's boat, walked onto the boat. One of Hamilton's friends, looked at him and said, "Hey, please don't shoot my friend." And Jones said, "No." And walked up to the end of the boat, aimed it at his chest, shot him off of the boat, and Hamilton fell back and exclaimed, "Boys, I am gone," which, if that's not the most soap opera-y thing that you could say, I'm not sure. That was an editorial more than likely, but he said, "Boys, I am gone," as he fell into the water. So Jones was very quickly arrested and thrown into jail and all that kind of stuff. His trial came up about a year later. He was actually in jail for basically a year before his trial came around. There were quite a few notables who were actually defending him or prosecuting him or any of that kind of stuff. And so he was found to be guilty, and then he was set to be executed, I think, about a month later, and then he got a stay of execution of 30 days from that month so they could levy more appeals and things. And while I'm talking about the appeals, one of the appeals for the law process of Jones being executed was there were 3 jurors on the actual jury stand who, before the case started, said they didn't like Jones. So it was really, it was very skewed not in his favor. Even though he did murder somebody, it was very skewed not in his favor. Apparently they ran through 200 people, 200 different jurors, because the news had gotten out so fast. They had the problem of finding an actual jury pool that was unbiased. Clearly they didn't do a good job, but they tried, I guess. So that's what happened with him. He eventually was taken from the prison, taken into a wagon, sat on top of a pine coffin, which was probably his, which was probably pretty traumatizing. Sat on a pine coffin, taken on a wagon, down Clay Street, which is actually this direction from the museum, up 5th Street, down to Old City Cemetery. They sat him at the gallows. They had 3 hours of events beforehand, which, is something. He stood up on the gallows. They tied the rope around him, dropped him down the hole. The rope broke. He fell and hit the ground and got up, cursed a little bit. They apologized and gave him a small glass of water, which he drank, and he got back up on the gallows. They tied the rope again, hung him, and this time it actually went through. And so this guy was actually probably the most interesting one because his actually ends in a small ghost story. When he was hung that second time, his body was on display for an hour. And then some of the local doctors took him mysteriously to a local, like a mill that was nearby. And the quote, I believe, was, "Some believe an autopsy was performed on a man that had been hung for an hour on some gallows." So I'm not sure why they needed an autopsy or anything like that. But they did an autopsy, and then apparently every night afterwards, which could be, a couple days, could be a week, whatever, there was a bright, white, ghostly light that showed up inside of this mill. All of the windows shook and rattled, and the whole thing rattled. And then a man would show up at the window and then summarily throw a man's skin into the pond. I'm not sure what that means. That's the quote. I'm not exaggerating at all. He would throw a man's skin into the pond. But there was a good number of executions that weren't public. I specifically talk about the public ones because those were tried and executed in Lynchburg. There were a few of them that happened in Campbell County that I didn't talk about. Actually, one of them was pretty horrifying, where a man was hung on the gallows and he had his arms tied around his back, and he attempted to wrench his legs up to his neck to actually push the rope off, which is a really horrifying picture if you think about it. But that happened in Campbell County. That didn't happen in Lynchburg. And so there are a lot of those. There's also a pretty good number of enslaved executions that would have happened, and these were private. These would have happened either in the jail or possibly on the grounds. I mean, there's a couple of places that could happen with that. And those actually are interesting in and of themselves because the owners would be given reparations for those enslaved people who were killed. They were considered property, so you lost property, you were paid for that property, even though they were people who were being killed and executed. It's a very interesting and weird thing to sort of research and look at. There were also 2 other executions as well as all the rest of those, where I couldn't find any information about them. There's a good chance that people just didn't want this to be publicly known, but it was written down in at least one source that there were 2 military executions of 2 African-American boys who were stealing. They were alleged to have been stealing things either within the camp or from somebody, and they were executed in Lynchburg. But again, there's not really any information that I can find on those. We just know that they happened. I don't know anything specific. By the Confederate Army, I'm not sure exactly what happened with them. But otherwise, beyond those ones that I mentioned, I specifically tried to talk about the 3 public executions within Lynchburg City. These are the ones that were tried and executed here.
So the building has some interesting characteristics. Out back, if you look at the back of the building, that faces where the old jail was, the old jail yard was. On the opposite side of Clay Street, there are mason marks outside, and we don't know what the mason marks mean, but they were originally put there by the builders of the building, and we don't know what they're for. We don't know what they mean, and it's never been interpreted in any way that I know of. There's also some gargoyles that are around the top of the building. They aren't the original anymore, but we do have an original in our collection, and it's on display. The description was supposed to be lions, but the builders here in Lynchburg in the 1850s didn't know what a lion looked like. They could all agree what a pig looked like. So if you look at the gargoyles today, they look more like pigs than lions, but they were water spouts, but they're also meant to keep evil spirits out of the building.
So we're on the 2nd floor of the courthouse. This is an interesting floor because this is where most of the first-hand accounts take place. And the thing about this floor is there are stories, multiple stories, where they've seen the same guy in a red coat walking in the same hallway that I'm walking in right now. Now, something that was a bit odd was that before Emily and Christian reached out to do an investigation, we had received calls on our haunted hotline about stories from former employees or people that had been here and just had heard things, and one of those stories was a gentleman walking down the hallway in a red coat that had a distinct smell to him. So this is, for me, a good hotspot to set up the EMF, do some EMF readings, and set up the night vision camera. And Emily now has some actual documented history that she's looking over that we're going to basically read out while we have these an audio recorder, EMF, night vision. We have all that going on in this room, and we're going to read it and see what we have.
One day, while I was seated at my desk on the 2nd floor, facing out into the hallway, it was about 5 p.m., and I knew that only myself and the secretary were in the building. At least I thought so. I happened to look up and saw the figure of someone walk through the hallway toward the front of the building. It looked like a man in a red coat. I waited for a moment, then heard or saw nothing, so I got up from my desk and walked out to the hallway. I saw no one. I went into the secretary's office and said, "I thought our coworker who wears a red coat had left." She said he did. I said, "No, he just walked through the hallway." And she said, "What did you see?" "A man in a red coat." She said that she had seen him before, usually in the afternoon hours, and about 5 p.m. he walks through the hallway. He still makes an appearance. Not every day, but it's always around 5 p.m. That was the first account. The second account says, "In a different office located on the 2nd floor, my desk faced into the room, meaning my back was to the door. On numerous occasions, I would have the feeling that someone was standing behind me in the doorway or had walked through the hallway. I would turn to look and see a figure with a red torso fade away. In that same office, on many occasions, music could be heard directly over my desk, as if it was coming from the ceiling. If I looked up or looked around, it would fade away. On occasion, I would ask a coworker to come into the office to hear the music, but they never could." So the next story is about children laughing. And this takes place in the break room that I showed you right across from the elevator. The old curator's office once contained our research library. Some of the shelving was located behind a door, which led into another office. Maybe that's not the old curator's office. Anyway, it's one of these rooms up here. Okay.
On the second floor.
On the second floor.
On the second floor.
The old curator's office once contained our research library. Some of the shelving was located behind a door, which led into another office. If I needed to get the research material on those shelves, the door would have to be swung open first, but by moving a brick which kept it from closing on its own. When I would step near the shelves behind the door, the sound of children laughing could always be heard. There were times when the curator was present and I would say, "Can you hear that?" The response was yes, but then it would always fade away. The brick is still in place because the door will always close on its own, although I never hear the laughter any longer. So there was an employee here and she was closing for the day, and we have security cameras all throughout the building, and one of them caught someone up here, probably right about where I'm sitting or in this area, and she saw someone sitting at the table. So she was closing, and she thought that she had to go tell someone to leave, so she comes up here and no one was here. And she searched around, no one, and like I said, we have cameras everywhere, so we'd be able to see if there was movement in the building, and there was no one here, and she looked all over, and there's no explanation for it, but she was sure enough she saw someone that she had to come up and tell them to leave.
And that she actually felt the need to review the security footage.
Well, she saw him in the footage.
She saw him in the footage.
Yeah, so we have, at the front desk where she was located, we have monitors, so you can see all of the cameras at once. And so she was sitting at the front desk looking in the monitors, and that's when she saw someone in the monitors.
Okay, so we just sat down for a while, and Emily read over a bunch of firsthand accounts and some of the history that has happened here, just like we talked to Christian and Emily before about some of the stories that they've uncovered. During that, I wouldn't say there's any concrete yet, like anything that would make you jump out of the chair, but while she was reading the firsthand account of the guy walking to the hallway and the office music, there was a slight knocking on the audio recorder that we have going that we'll monitor later, but there was a knocking. So they have an old Victrola here from the 1920s, and so from the time period, from the stories, we're going to play some music and see if we get any readings, anything like temperature spikes, drops, anything like that. And we're going to set the camera up wide angle, just kind of listen to see what we pick up, because this is what we believe the music to be that the one story heard, and from the same time period where the first-hand accounts that they've heard and the haunted hotline calls that we've gotten about this, it seems to be in that 1920s-ish era. So we're gonna set the record up. We're gonna sit and listen and see what we find.
Are you filming me? Mm-hmm. Okay. So this lever was moved to off position, and you have to physically move it. Once you move it, the table spins. But if you have it that way, it stops it. And so just now when I couldn't get it to play, the lever was like physically in the off position. So that's kind of weird. definitely heard footsteps.
Yeah. Do you hear that like that? Are you hearing anything? Like just
Footsteps.
I feel like someone's like outside.
I don't think we'd be able to hear them in here. In the basement, you can hear people outside really easily.
Yeah, I mean, I'm having a hard time. I have to listen after because I feel like I hear, or like it sounds like the, but a lot. You know what I'm saying? Like there's a crowd muffled. There's
Like a court one?
different voices. Okay, so we're now on the first floor. We were on the second floor in the hallway where we've heard a ton of stories. But while we were up there investigating, we kept hearing what sounded like crowd noise, like just men and women talking, rustling their feet, just movement. And there's no other way to explain them. Just a bunch of people in a room talking. And so we've decided to move down to the first level with the audio recorder, and Emily has been monitoring the stairwell here and heard distinct talking, so much so